We've only got 45 minutes and we've got the extensive subject of paying for care. So by definition, we will tend to go through things relatively briefly. So what I would say is if there are any issues that we spark an interest in, either this time at the end, ask a question. If not, please feel free to come onto the helpline and ask us in a bit more detail. So to kind of cover everything, I've split it into three main sections. The first bit is benefits and what I call assistances. Then I'm going to move on to the state, local authority and NHS support, and then we will finish with self-funding. So hopefully we will cover something that is relevant to you or of interest to you through those three main sections. It is probably one of the most difficult sessions because it gets a bit technical, but it is a technical kind of issue. So as I say, if I raise anything that doesn't make sense, please pop your hand up. So if we start with the basics of benefits, and the idea is this would kind of take you through the stages of care. So the most common first benefit that somebody receives as a result of a care need is attendance allowance. But I am still astonished at how many people do not claim attendance allowance because they believe they will qualify, either because of their condition, usually I'm not being attended, or more commonly because they think they have too much money. So just to dispel a few quick myths. First one is that attendance allowance is not means tested in terms of capital or income. It doesn't matter how much money you've got, how much income you've got, you are not going to be prohibited from claiming. And secondly, you do not need to be attended. You merely have to have the ability to demonstrate the need to be attended. So it can be used for all sorts: taxis, cleaners, shopping deliveries, whatever you want. There are no interferences from the DWP in terms of what you do. It's an important benefit in its own right, there's no doubt, but the other key thing is it's a gateway benefit. In other words, it becomes the precondition of lots of other things. So those people who don't claim it because they think they won't qualify, it automatically means that they miss out on so many other things. So a couple of quick basic issues to bear in mind. There are two levels of support, lower and upper, which are not particularly descriptive, but the lower is worth £72.65 a week and is available for anybody who needs, and I quote the terms, frequent or constant supervision during the day or night. Now that's open to interpretation, I appreciate, but basically it's people who need help with day-to-day issues, be that bathing, eating, washing, cooking, cleaning, anything of that nature. So I find that most people can readily demonstrate eligibility for that. The higher rate is a bit more difficult, but it's worth £108.55 per week. And the additional requirement there is that you need that help during the night time. So the concept is that most people need a bit of help during the day with day-to-day issues, but they're fine then until the following morning. Those people who are not fine until the following morning will get the higher rate. So just to recap, not needs tested, don't have to actually have the attended arrangements, you merely have to need it. It's not taxable, and it provides this important gateway benefit. The best fact sheet I've seen on attendance allowance is produced by Age UK. It's fairly extensive, but does explain everything. You can apply online. It's not the easiest form, but the key section for me on the application form is the medication, because that gives the person checking it a very good idea of the fact that there's something wrong with you, whether you're on high blood pressure tablets or whatever it may be. Two circumstances when you cannot receive the benefit is when you're in hospital for an extended period, or if you're receiving funded caring support from your local authority. So you can have a situation where you qualify for attendance allowance, You then have a 12-week stay in hospital, in which case the benefit will cease. You then come out and the benefit will resume. But you can't receive it as well as funding from your local authority. But as I say, it's a key benefit. I remember having an argument not that many months ago with a doctor, a GP, who was convinced that his father didn't qualify because he had too much money. So if our GPs don't know how to claim attendance allowance, then it's not surprising that the rest of us don't. So that would be my number one first port of call. The second one, which also falls into this kind of general early stage of care support, is carers allowance, which has been sort of very much in the headlines of late. So this is £81.90 a week, not a huge amount, but it's payable to the person who is providing the care. So not the individual who needs it, but the person providing it. And the two key requirements there are that you should be providing help for at least 35 hours a week, which sounds a lot, but I'll explain what it includes because it probably isn't. And that the person who you're caring for is in receipt of benefits such as attendance allowance, PIP. Again, this gateway benefit concept. You don't have to be related to the person you're caring for. You don't have to live with them. They could just be your next door neighbour. There is no relationship requirement. You don't get paid extra if you look after or care for more than one person. And if two people look after the same person, there's still only one carers allowance. So as I said, 35 hours a week sounds like a lot, but you can include help with washing, cooking, taking the person to the doctor's appointment, helping with household tasks, managing bills, shopping, pretty much everything. So when you see it in that context, it very quickly becomes reasonably easy to find yourself almost performing a full-time job in caring for somebody who can't look after themselves. Now, there is one very important issue I just want to cover on this. Currently, you cannot receive carers allowance if your earnings are more than £151 a week. And some of you may be aware last year that lots of people got themselves in trouble because they got a pay rise in their part-time job that took them over that threshold. So they didn't know, didn't tell the authorities, and there was a big hoo-ha about claiming that money back. Now, from April, that £151 goes up to £196, so a fairly significant increase from the government and much welcome. So that's going to bring more and more people into the position where they can claim this. Now, the group of people I think are particularly worth bearing in mind are those people who are over the age of 55 but haven't reached their state pension age. I'll take that to be a lady, because it tends to be, who've reached the point where they need to work less to look after mum or dad or both of them, but maybe can't quite afford to give up work entirely. So they would be looking for a part-time job or a reduction in hours. The £151 was obviously a bit of a constraint. The £196 will help, as I say, significantly. But it still might not be enough. 196 plus carers allowance isn't a king's ransom. And the area that we've noticed that is particularly relevant and so overlooked is that £151 going up to 196 does not include private pensions. Private pensions are excluded from the calculation. So you could, at age 57, as an example, reduce your hours or change job to a part-time basis, earn £196 a week from this April, claim and receive your carers allowance, and then use your private pension, draw down from your private pension to make up the difference, and that will not disqualify you from the benefit. We are seeing a lot of people who are pursuing that path. Because if you look at it economically, if that allows you to keep mum, dad, or aunt or whoever it may be out of care because you can provide that help for them, then the cost savings are significant. And if you can do it in a way that isn't going to leave you destitute, then just knowing that issue about the private pension can be, and I'm amazed at how often that isn't raised. So my opportunity today to just make sure that you're aware of it and that you can tell other people, because it does make a huge difference. One benefit I'm going to mention but not explain because it's too complicated is pension credit. This basically was the replacement for income support as used to be. And the idea is it will top up a person's income to a minimum level. As I say, it is complicated. It doesn't have a fixed value because it depends on your circumstances, but it's become all the more critical now because it is the precursor requirement of the winter fuel payment. So what we're finding is it's quite possible on pension credit to qualify for £2 a week. And therefore, as a benefit, you may think it isn't worth the hassle of filling the forms in. But of course it is now, because it may well be the basis of claiming your winter fuel payment. There are quite a few calculators out there. The government has its own. I personally think that the Age UK pension credit calculator is the best way. You just sit and punch in the numbers and it will tell you whether or not you qualify. And one final, not really a benefit, but just something to bear in mind. If you do, as I suggested earlier, reduce your work in order to care for somebody, remember to claim carers credit. That is basically a national insurance credit. So rather than run the risk of missing out the last 10 years of your working life on your national insurance contribution, if you're caring for somebody for more than 20 hours a week, you can have the carers credit, which will ensure you receive your full state pension when you get there. So important just to pick that up. And then finally, I've just got a few benefits. They're not real benefits in the normal sense of the word, but they're things to be aware of. Most obvious one is the council tax exemption for those people who have been diagnosed with dementia. If you have a formal diagnosis, which I appreciate is not always easy to get these days, then you will get a 25% reduction if you're a couple, or you'll get exemption if the person is living alone, which I appreciate may be less likely. A couple of others to bear in mind: blind allowance. This is an enhanced income tax benefit, but worth £3,070 a week from this, £3,070 a year from this April. It isn't really a blind allowance. If you have a visual impairment, and I'm particularly thinking here about macular degeneration, then you will qualify for that. It may not give you any extra money, but it will mean that you could earn more money from your pensions or from your interest or whatever it might be without paying tax. So worth having a look at, worth claiming. And I think it's quite common to get that backdated retrospectively, providing you've got the diagnosis. And other things are really just such as blue badge is the obvious one to pick up on, which has to just make life easier in terms of parking if you're trying to take somebody to hospital or to well, just out and about anywhere, to be perfectly honest. So there's lots of bits and pieces available. It's not a particularly coordinated system. You've got to go off and look for it. So my advice to carers is go and check. Don't assume. It's worth going to the CAB, presenting your situation. They will help you to do a benefit check to make sure that you're getting everything that you're entitled to. And I won't say they will all help you with the forms, because that's a bit of a contentious issue. Some of these forms are huge in terms of length, so they're naturally a little bit reluctant. But if you've got a bit that's difficult, there's nothing wrong with going to your doctor and say, can you help me fill in this section of the attendance allowance form so I'm describing mum's condition accurately and all the medication that she may be on. So that's my quick run through general benefits. I now sort of want to move on generally for people who have a more acute care need. usually a natural progression from that first situation, but where now you need some professional help, probably not likely to be just limited to family and friends. And I'm afraid here the big determinant is money. It's the be all and end all of the process. So just to take you through the key numbers, 23,250 is the magic number. If you have more than that, you will not get help from your local authority. If you have less than that, you may do, and I'll explain why. Now, the important asset within this equation is the house. So anybody who owns their own house will, by definition, have more than £23,250. So let's just be clear about the occasions when the value of the house would be excluded from this calculation. And there are a number of statutory exclusions that the local authority must make. So the first one is if the house is occupied by a spouse or civil partner. It's sad the number of times we speak to people on the helpline who are worried sick that if, you might be speaking to the husband and he's worried that if his wife has to go into care, how will he pay? Will he have to sell the house? Will he become homeless? Because they just don't realise that that exclusion exists. So that's the first one. The second one is that if it's occupied by somebody over the age of 60, that doesn't actually have to be a relative, although usually it is. But that could be anybody, son, daughter, niece, nephew, lodger. If they're over the age of 60, then the house value must be automatically excluded. Now, there are also a couple of, they're not statutory disregards, but they're discretional ones. An example of that would be somebody living in the house who has been caring for the person for an extended period of time. That's quite a difficult one. I'll give you two quick examples. We might get a call to say that the son has lived with mum, has never left home, basically. He's lived in the house all of his life. Mum now needs care, and he will claim that the house should be exempt on the basis that he has been her carer, which he may well have been. The local authority's view is to say your role as carer is incidental to the fact that you live there, and they would quite regularly not apply the disregard, particularly if they're under 60. If they're over 60, they have no choice. But I had a case a few years ago where a chap moved back home after his mum had a stroke. He'd worked in Holland. He moved back from Amsterdam, sold his flat, moved back to look after mum. Had only been there 3 months. She had a severe stroke and could no longer return home, and had to go into care. The local authority quite rightly gave them a 2-year exemption on the house to allow time for the carer to reorganise his life, because he clearly had come back with the intention of looking after mum. We could spend the session just on this one subject, issues of joint ownership, houses in trust, houses that have been given away, half houses that have been given away. We obviously can't go into every single circumstance. So if the issue of the house is important for you, then please give us a ring and have a chat through. So once we've determined whether the house is in or out of the equation, then our 23,250 figure becomes the baseline, really. And if you now qualify, then you will get help from the local authority, but it will only be provided subject to a need assessment. So basically, the local authority will assess the individual to determine what type of care they need. That might be 2 home visits a day, or it might be a move into a care home setting. And after that need assessment has been completed, then the financial assessment follows on to determine who will pay for the assessed care need. And the local authority are obliged to do it in that order: assess need first, and then look at who pays second. To be perfectly honest, my argument would be if you know you are going to be self-funded, there is no point in going through the local authority process, that it will just take time, clog up the system and won't really achieve anything. I would make a distinction if your capital is close to the 23,250 or is likely to reach that point before too long. Then it may be better to get the local authority involved now so that there is an agreement about what type of care should be provided. So we then come to the who pays bit and how much do they pay. So if we start with the most basic home care arrangement, then because you've got less than 23,250, the local authority will assist you. You will basically be expected to make a contribution to that care cost, really based on your spare income. So they've got to make allowances for your normal living costs. That might result in mum or dad having to pay £10 a week, for example. But you can't be left with less money than you need to live on. And let's be clear, if you're living in your own home and you need care, the likelihood is that all of your income will be consumed in that, and your contribution will be quite small. We then move on to the situation of where you've moved into care, then it becomes a little bit more complicated. The local authority will assess your income. Basically, they will take all of your income and use it, and expect you to use it as your contribution towards your care costs. So they would take the state pension, any benefits that you might receive. In terms of your private pension, if you've got income from your private pension, then they will only take half of that into account, providing you are paying the other half to your spouse or civil partner, because obviously they may still be living at home and will still have the costs of the property to maintain. So it's not quite so straightforward. You've got to work out what that contribution would be. And then a number of things happen that then really start to make that complicated. The first one is that although we've got the 23,250 as the top threshold, there's a lower threshold of 14,250. And the significance of that is that if your savings are between those two figures, then you will be required to make a contribution, not because of your income or your pension, but effectively in lieu of the interest that your capital is deemed to be producing. The trouble is it has no relationship to the interest that you receive. And the formula for this, it's called tariff income, and does cause lots of confusion. But basically, they divide the difference between the two thresholds, which is £9,000 between the 14,250 and the 23,250, and they divide that into £250 slices. So if you had £23,249, in other words, you just seen your capital drop down below the threshold, then they would take the view that you've got 36 parcels of £250 being the difference in that £9,000 between the two thresholds. And the process is that you pay £1 a week for every £250, which works out to £36 a week that you would pay as a consequence of you having those savings. If you work it out as an equivalent interest rate, assuming you had the money in a bank, it works out to 20.8%. So you will see your capital erode because of the way that tariff income is applied. There is a little bit of an offset. When you get down to 14,250, that tariff income calculation stops and you wouldn't be expected to make a contribution from your savings. And there's a little bit of an offset. You are allowed to keep, it's called the personal expense allowance. This is a sum of money that is expected or is designed to pay for things like toiletries, newspapers, bits and pieces that you might have, and that's £30.15 a week. So in some respects, the personal expense allowance offsets the tariff income until your figures start to change, but it causes no end of confusion for people trying to work their way through it. So then comes the issue of the care home fees, which is perhaps the most contentious element. It's important to appreciate that the local authority has what's called a tariff of fees. These are figures and amounts that the council will agree at the start of the year that they will pay for a given level of care. And there usually are several bands. So residential care with dementia, nursing care with dementia. There's quite a series of them. But that is the price that the local authority will permit, if that's the right word, for a given level of care. So basically what they will do is they will take that tariff rate. Let's just imagine it's £800 a week. They will work out what income the person has that is accessible. Let's assume that's £300 a week. The local authority will pay the difference. And that's how the contribution calculation is worked out. Now, of course, not every home will charge the rate that the local authority would ideally like to pay. So it's quite common for homes to charge a higher figure. And you have the right to make up that difference. So if the local authority would pay 800 and the care home's charging 1,000, then that £200 a week is termed a top-up. But the important thing to remember is that the individual themselves cannot pay it. They cannot pay it out of their 23,250. The reasons are fairly obvious, because that will just accelerate the rate at which they stop paying tariff income. So the system is designed to prevent that. And the top-up basically must be paid by a third party, which is basically the family. So it's important when selecting homes and putting together the care funding package that these things are understood and thrashed out at the beginning so that everybody's clear. Now, of course, lots of people will find themselves in a situation where they have less than 23,250, but they may have a house that will now be sold because they've had to move out in order to move into care. So there are a couple of funding issues there that are worth bearing in mind. The first one is that in such a situation, the value of the property will be disregarded for the first 12 weeks. And the idea of this is to give people time to take the typical scenario of somebody's had a stroke, left hospital, moved into care, perhaps in a sense of seeing if this is the best option for them. The local authority will ignore the value of the property for 12 weeks to allow time for you to decide if this is going to be a permanent issue or a temporary issue. Now, if at the end of that 12 weeks, the person decides, yes, care in a care home is still the best option, we've still got less than 23,250 and a house to sell, and the local authority is now obliged to offer what's called a deferred payment agreement. And this is basically a system where the council will pay your care fees, but instead of it being paid by them, you owe it back at the end of the day when the house is sold. So it's quite common to see a formal charge set up on the house by the council so that you would then repay that money at the end of the period when the house is sold. It does actually mean that you could, if you so wish, never sell the house and stay forever on a deferred payment agreement. It would become repayable effectively on death. And I have met some families who want to do that because they either have an attachment to the house or they believe the house value will go up better than the interest that they have to pay on that deferred payment agreement. The interest rate is set by central government. It's not horrific. There are a few charges that are applied, which are also modest. It's not a profit centre for local authorities. It's a service that they have to provide under statute. So it is quite common for people to find themselves moving through a whole series of different funding arrangements. They might start life self-funding with cash and savings. That money might drop down to the threshold, but they haven't sold the house. Then they might go onto a deferred payment agreement. Then they might sell the house and become self-funding. So it's not uncommon to see people dip in and out of lots and lots of different phases of a care funding journey. And it's important to know that these things are available because they may shape your decisions. So it's important just to make sure that we understand that. Another thing to bear in mind, I use the example of somebody being in hospital and then being discharged. We do have a system of reablement, which is really a package of support that the local authority should provide. It used to be called convalescence many years ago, and the NHS used to provide it, but that's gone. But local authorities recognise that if they can provide some support when a person comes out of hospital, because their medical attention has been concluded, and this happens, well, it's probably the central problem of our care system at the moment, which is the hospital want to get the bed free and want to discharge people as soon as the medical intervention is over, but that individual is totally unable to go back home and carry on as normal. And reablement is, well, I think it's the key going forward to give people the time to recover. The trouble is, you've got two different parts of government fighting each other because the local authority is funded locally and the NHS is funded centrally. So basically, you become the ping pong as one tries to pass you over to the other. And this is where we end up with bed blocking and people unable to get into a ward because there are 25 people there who shouldn't be there, but there's nowhere else for them to go. Anyway, we don't want to get off into too many discussions about what's wrong with the system, but that is where the logjam sits. So just remember, reablement is a very important part of a recovery period for care. And quite often as well, you'll see that that period is used for an assessment. You know, how able is this person now after what might be a stroke or a hip replacement or any number of things. We've argued many times with hospital discharge coordinators that this whole discussion should take place the day the person arrives in care into the hospital before their operation. My stepmom had a hip replacement a few years ago, and she'd been in there for a week. But it was only on the last day that somebody said, "Now, Jean, how are you going to cope when you go home?" To my mind, if that conversation had started on day one, everybody would have had a bit more time to work out what the best option was. So speaking about the NHS, there is one final piece to the jigsaw, if you like, of state-funded support, and that is the NHS itself. So if you have an ultra-acute need, then it is possible that you would receive what's called continuing health care, which is basically all of your care fees paid with no contribution from the individual, not even their pension. Now, in order to get that, it's extremely difficult. You almost have to be an individual who, under normal circumstances, would be in hospital. Now, this can be individuals who would be moving into a hospice, but we get lots of people contacting us to say, will I qualify? The general answer I give is no, unless your situation is exceptional. And people get confused. They think that dementia is a basis of this. It should be. We have a strange system in this country where people talk about postcode lotteries. We have disease lotteries. If your condition was cancer, you would get everything paid for by the state. You would never expect a bill. But if you're unfortunate enough to suffer from Alzheimer's disease, then that simply isn't the case, because it's viewed as social care and really just, it's not medical intervention in the same sense. So generally speaking, you won't get that. But there is a step down from that, which is called FNC, or funded nursing care. And as the name suggests, this is for people who need a bit of nursing input, the kind of thing that the NHS is expected to do. It's a sizable sum, £235.88 a week. And it's paid by the NHS, and it's paid directly to the care home. So the simple guide is, if your care need is assessed as nursing, then effectively you will get this. It's a one flat rate. There's no variable. You might just need a bit of it, or you might need a lot of it, but you still get the same amount. And it's paid directly to the care home. That in itself does cause confusion, because when you go to the home and say, what are the fees? You have to be clear, is that the fee after funded nursing care or before? Because it's a £235 is a lot of money. And you may not know to even ask the question, and you're reliant on the care home explaining. So anybody who moves into a nursing home, particularly from a residential home, make sure that extra money is claimed, and be clear about how that works in terms of the overall fee. So the final section I want to just touch on is the self-funded. So when all of those things have either applied but now been replaced, usually by the sale of the house, that's usually the point at which this would step in. Then effectively we've got to think about what options will be available to try and help with this problem. So I'm just going to use a fairly basic example. Most people are self-funded, as I said, because they've sold their house, and I'm going to take the sort of national average house price plus some savings. So we might have a person with £300,000, just as a simple example. So if we're looking at a care home of £1,000 a week, which is not at all uncommon, and may well be considerably more, and they've got pension and benefit income of, let's say, £400 a week, then we've got a shortfall of £600 a week that the individual has to find without any help from their local authority. So that's £30,000 a year to be generated from £300,000 of money in the bank, having sold the house. So you're looking at a fairly challenging requirement of basically earning 10% a year of interest in order to pay for the fees and keep the capital intact. Now, a couple of years ago, that would have sounded ludicrous when interest rates were, 1% or 0.5%. It's a bit easier now. We've also got to bear in mind that care fees have shot up dramatically because of the cost of living crisis, the cost of employing people, energy, all the rest of it. So the situation is just as bad as it was. So basically, the capital would decline each year. If the person lives long enough, then eventually the capital will fall back down to the 23,250 and the whole process will start over again. And the challenge that families face and individuals face in this situation is twofold. Really, it's the risk of longevity. We all want our loved one to live kind of as long as possible. But in this circumstances, it may lead to the point where that person then is claiming from the local authority. I may be in a care home that doesn't accept the local authority price. So you've got this concern about top-up fees. So I just wanted to mention one thing that is available. It's certainly not for everybody, but there are a small group of specialist insurance companies who will take over that risk of longevity from you. Let me just explain how it works. So basically, they would look at your mum or dad's situation and they would make a dispassionate assessment of their life expectancy. This doesn't involve any medical assessment. It's based on information from the care home, from the GP. And they've got the expertise and the experience to be able to say, for example, we think dad's life expectancy from this point is 3 years. And you want £30,000 a year paid. Therefore, we want £90,000 from you, but we have to make a profit. So we're going to charge you £100,000. So the scenarios are as follows. If dad lives to be 107, then the insurance company are crying in their beer because they've taken £100,000 off you and paid however many years of £30,000 out. If, on the other hand, dad died after 18 months, then the insurance company would be the winner because they will have received £100,000, but perhaps only paid out 45. So what this does is it allows you to manage risk. It allows you to effectively guarantee an estate value. It also guarantees that you can maintain independence of the local authority, and it also means you can maintain the choice of home that you would want. You don't have to worry about the issue of top-ups. Now, it's not for everybody. I would guess, in my experience, that maybe, I don't know, 25% of people find that an option. You've got to remember that insurance companies are not nice, cuddly people. They are commercial organizations. By definition, they will take more money off us than they will give us back. So you have to go into the proposition expecting to lose monetarily, but you're buying peace of mind and you're buying that security. And you're effectively underpinning a minimum family inheritance. So you've got to weigh up whether that's a good idea, whether it suits. I would also say it's worth getting a costing for it, because what it gives you is a third party's assessment of your person's life expectancy, which is an extremely difficult thing for us to do individually. We're far too close to it. So it can be helpful to think, right, well, if they think mum will live for 4 years, then that gives me an idea. I'm not going to do that particular plan, but at least I now know kind of where I might be working. They may be no more accurate than you or I would be, but at least it gives you something. Now, I've just added one 5-minute section at the end here, which is just to cover some things that don't really fall into any particular categories, but they are very relevant in terms of funding care. The first one is a really simple one. We see it so often where mum or dad write wills and they leave specific amounts to the grandchildren, typically. I saw one a couple of weeks ago where they'd left 25,000 between their 4 grandchildren, can't remember how many it was. And that will had been written 15 years ago when they just retired and had quite a bit of money saved up. And of course, it took no account of the care need. So by the time the person died, they only had £30,000. So 25 of it went to the grandchildren and the balance went to the children. And of course, when the will was written, the expectation was the grandchildren would get 25,000 and the children would get the other 200. So my advice is always quote bequests in percentage terms rather than fixed amounts if there is any possibility of a care need, because it can create a complete skew on how money is distributed and completely against what the person was thinking of. And on that same vein, I would also mention common practice is for particularly older couples to, in their wills, leave everything to each other and then on to the children. They're called mirror wills. It's the most common form. I would suggest that if you've got family couples, that you talk to them about rewriting their will. Sounds terrible, but disinherit each other. The example, let's take our £300,000 house. Mum and dad own that together. And let's just imagine dad dies, leaves his half to mum, a mirror will, and she then goes into care. The house will then be vacant, so it won't be exempt, and she will be required to spend from 300,000 down to 23,250 before she gets any help. If, on the other hand, dad had left his half of the house to somebody other than mum, and vice versa, first one dies, second one requires care, then they will only have £150,000 worth of capital to be spent down to 23,250 before they get some help. And the other 150,000 will effectively have been ring-fenced and protected and can be very useful for paying top-up fees. Now, we could spend a session, again, just on how you do that, but I do encourage people to look at their wills and how they're worded. Just one word of warning. You can own property in 2 ways. You can own it jointly, or you can own it as something called tenants in common. If you own something jointly, regardless of what you write in your will, it will automatically go to the other owner on the first person's death. That would apply to a bank account or a house. So it's not just a case of rewriting the will. You also have to go and change the way you own the property. Sounds a really dramatic process. You have to sever the tenancy. It's not dramatic at all. It's just one sheet of paper. So if you need help on some of these really kind of technical but crucially important issues, then I would suggest you go to the Society of Later Life if it's financial, and you'll find a team of specialists on their website in your area who can help. If it's a more legal issue, then I would suggest there's an organisation called Lifetime Lawyers. They're ordinary lawyers, but they've demonstrated a specialism in issues to do with later life. And again, you'll find lots of them in your area who might be able to help. And if it's just something we've touched on, then ourselves at the Care Advice Line would be happy to help just sort of steer you off filling, because I appreciate I've covered an enormous amount there in 45 minutes of a fairly technical nature, but I just hope it gives you a rough idea. Now, we should have been sat here talking about the reforms that were due to commence in October of this year that would have brought in the care cap and a whole range of reforms to the funding system. Unfortunately, they have been terminated in effect, and we've now got the start of a new commission to look into this whole issue, but one which isn't due to report for several years. And even when they do, if the past is anything to go by, there is usually a huge leading period. So the reality is there are no changes on the way. The current system will apply, and probably will apply for the lifetime of most people who currently have a care need. So it's important that we all get the very best we can out of the system as it stands, and that's really been our objective today.